Georgia Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock, said that he's very encouraged by Joe Manchin's proposals and told NBC News, quote, "I have never been opposed to voter ID."
You could accept this compromise, what Joe Manchin laid out, even if voter ID was part of it.
That's one of the fallacies of Republican talking points that have been deeply disturbing. No one has ever objected to having to prove who you are to vote. It's been part of our nation's history since the inception of voting.
We have seen over the last 20 years a constriction on who has the right to use that right. We have seen it through voter ID laws.
Millions of Americans don't have the IDs required in this measure. Well, that makes it a lot harder for millions of Americans to vote.
Unfortunately, voter ID requirements that may seem like common sense to some turn out to have a serious anti-democratic impact in practice.
With these unnecessary and unjustifiable voter ID laws, which constitute, in my estimation, a poll tax.
Dealing with these voter ID laws, this is not about voter verification, this is about voter suppression.
When Democrats have organized efforts to register new voters, they've gotten some resistance from Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp. His office has rejected applicants whose names or addresses didn't check out. And when voters go to the polls, they have to show an ID. Democrats have described this and other measures as voter suppression.
We know that voter ID laws seem perfectly normal, but if you lived in Alabama when they passed their voter ID law, they also shut down 2/3, I believe, of the organizations of the DMVs in black communities so that the very people who needed those IDs would not be able to get them.
To intentionally, I believe, attempt to prevent whole populations of people from exercising their constitutional right to vote in their elections.
Laws seem very basic, but the application and the implication is that your vote doesn't matter.
The new law will now also require photo ID to request an absentee ballot, like voting in person.
It continues to, I think, will allow Georgia to have secure, accessible, fair elections.
But the White House says that could discourage elderly, poor, and minority voters, less likely to have government-issued ID.
Each and every time voter ID bills come up, they are proven to have an effect that suppresses the vote of working families and minorities across the state of Michigan. Join me in telling Republicans, cut the red tape on voter IDs and hands off our hard-earned right to participate in the voting process.
When it comes to voter registration laws, one Tennessee congressman is speaking out. Representative Jim Cooper held a meeting in Nashville today to bring awareness to how he says ID laws like the one in our state hurt the vote. He says our state's law is the most restrictive and that it targets the poor and downtrodden. But he says you can combat the issue by going to the polls.
The administration clearly so eager to speak out, the president also used Twitter and a more formal statement vowing to act.
That's one of the fallacies of Republican talking points that have been deeply disturbing. No one has ever objected to having to prove who you are to vote. It's been part of our nation's history since the inception of voting.